It's my pleasure to present this overview briefing on Operation Urgent Fury in Grenada. Let's turn back the clock to 1983 and shift our focus to the sunny, breezy East Caribbean island of Grenada, known principally for tourism and nutmeg, and relive Operation Urgent Fury. At the end of a chain of Caribbean islands known as the Lesser Antilles, Grenada sits astride the main shipping lane for supertankers that bring the bulk of U.S. imported oil from the Mideast and Africa. You can see here its location in relation to Venezuela on mainland South America and in relation to the other Caribbean islands all the way up the chain to Puerto Rico and Cuba. It is a beautiful island with a typical tropical climate. It's about 20 miles long by 10 miles wide, ironically about the size of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where the 82nd Airborne is stationed. The island has a population of about 110,000 people, 30,000 of whom live in its capital city of St. George's. Much of the island is covered with jungle, and its rugged interior rises to the highlands in the center of the island around the Grand Etang. The principal military features of the island, besides the excellent harbor at St. George's, are its two airfields. One is in the north, a 3,000-foot runway at Pearls, just north of the town of Grenville, which, until Operation Urgent Fury, functioned as the island's principal airport. Most important for our purposes today is the 9,100-foot runway at Point Salinas, then under construction by some 600 Cuban construction workers. I think that most of you are familiar with the chain of events that led to the deteriorating situation in Grenada in October 1983. On the 13th, Prime Minister Maurice Bishop was removed from office by the Central Committee of his own New Jewel movement and placed under house arrest. There were about 1,000 American citizens living on Grenada, most of them students at the St. George's Medical University. In a fairly routine response to an incident of this kind, the National Security Council requested that the Joint Chiefs of Staff monitor the situation, and the JCS in turn alerted the Commander-in-Chief, United States Atlantic Command, located in Norfolk, Virginia, to plan for a possible non-combatant evacuation operation. On the 19th of October, a large crowd in St. George's marched to Bishop's house and freed him from house arrest. There was a confrontation between Grenadian militia and People's Revolutionary Army and the crowd. The crowd was fired upon, and reports indicated that dozens were killed. Bishop and 5 of his followers were taken into custody and were killed that night. General Hudson Austin, commander of the People's Revolutionary Army, announced a round-the-clock curfew with orders to shoot any violators on sight. The situation was chaotic, uncertain, and it was questionable who, if anyone, was really in charge. In response to the worsening situation in Grenada, the following day, Thursday, now D-5, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a warning order to St. Lant. Be prepared to conduct military operations to evacuate non-combatants. Military Airlift Command and the United States Readiness Command were placed in support of the operation. St. Lant immediately identified the forces available to him. The forces were based around the USS Independence Carrier Battle Group and a Marine Amphibious Ready Group. At the time, the Marine Amphibious Ready Group was en route to Lebanon to replace U.S. peacekeeping forces there. The group had as its basic combat element 1 battalion of Marines with associated aircraft. The following day, D-4, St. Lant directed both the Carrier Battle Group and the Marine Amphibious Ready Group to proceed at best speed to a modified location some 40 miles north of Grenada. Also early on D-4, the JCS expanded St. Lant's mission. In addition to the requirement to evacuate non-combatants, St. Lant was told to neutralize the Grenadian Army and militia forces. Also during that morning, St. Lant was asked to consider the use of Army, Special Mission, and airborne forces for the operation. By the end of the day, all of the Special Mission forces had been alerted, and both the 82nd Airborne Division and 18th Airborne Corps were told to send officers to a special planning meeting at United States Atlantic Command Headquarters in Norfolk the following day. The meeting at Norfolk on Saturday, D-3, was the first opportunity for the participants in the operation actually to meet face-to-face. The situation in Grenada and the estimate of enemy forces were presented. The gross numbers of people and equipment proved to be accurate. The disorganized nature of the Grenadian armed forces and the unsettled political situation on the island were stressed. For that reason, the force that was contemplated for the operation was quite small: one Marine battalion, one and perhaps two Ranger battalions, with a follow-on airborne force to relieve the assault units. The planners discussed a number of options for the operation, some involving only Marine forces, some involving only Army forces. All options contemplated only light forces. After the conference, representatives returned to their respective headquarters to brief their commanders on the operation. That afternoon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued its execute order to LANTCOM, Readiness Command, and the Military Airlift Command. You see the mission statement for the operation here. In response to requests from the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the operation now included other than U.S. forces. And you will see that the mission had been expanded to include stabilization and peacekeeping tasks. The execute time for the operation was set for not later than dawn on 25 October, Tuesday. By evening, the staffs of all units participating in the operation were conducting planning. On Sunday, D-2, the Commander-in-Chief, Atlantic Command, activated the forces that would participate in Operation Urgent Fury. You see here the task organization for the operation. SINCLANT designated a subordinate joint task force to command the operation. And that evening, LANTCOM issued its operations order for Operation Urgent Fury. The concept of operations was to split the island, with the Marine Task Force being responsible for the northern half and the Ranger Task Force responsible for objectives in the southern half. The Airborne Task Force would act as a follow-on force to relieve the other task forces. On D-1, the commanders for Operation Urgent Fury met at LANTCOM headquarters in Norfolk for final coordination. After final coordination, Vice Admiral Metcalf, commander of the Joint Task Force, left with his operational staff, stopped off at Barbados to accomplish final coordination with the Caribbean Peacekeeping Force, and joined the amphibious task force afloat. At mid-afternoon, LANTCOM published the final change to the operations order. Here's the mission statement. Note that it had become more complex. The concept of operations did not change. Here's the mission statement, of course, for the Airborne Task Force. And finally, the rules of engagement for the operation. President Reagan signed the execute order, and Operation Urgent Fury launched that night with the Ranger forces taking off for Grenada. Operations unfolded rapidly on D-Day. For clarity, I will discuss the operation by task force. The sequence of events, of course, appears much clearer now in retrospect than it did at the time. First, the Marine Task Force in the north. Rain squalls delayed the initial heliborne assault, but by 0730, a Marine Rifle Company was astride Pearls Airfield, and the airfield had been declared secure. Throughout the rest of the day, Marines continued to consolidate their positions with little or no enemy contact. However, in the southern area of the Ranger Task Force, the situation was far different. This was the Ranger Force mission for Operation Urgent Fury. One of the objectives was a True Blue campus where the U.S. students were reported to be concentrated. The drop zone for the operation was the Point Salinas airfield, and because it was covered with obstacles, the parachute option was the only one open to the Ranger Force. The plan was to drop from aircraft flying in trail formation from an altitude of 500 feet. As the lead aircraft approached the drop zone, it was met by anti-aircraft fire from automatic weapon positions around the airfield. These positions contained both the ZSU-23, the twin-barreled 25mm automatic cannon, and the four-barreled machine gun anti-aircraft weapons. The lead aircraft dropped its full load of 42 Rangers. The remainder of the aircraft broke off and went into a racetrack formation to the south of the airstrip, while an AC-130 Spectre gunship began its firing runs to suppress the anti-aircraft fire. Using its Vulcan 20mm cannon, 40mm automatic cannon, and the 105 howitzer, Spectre worked the ridges around the airfield for the next hour and a half, while 1 to 4 aircraft at a time, the remainder of the Ranger Force made their drops. By around 0700, both battalions were on the ground and clearing the drop zone. While part of the Ranger Force assaulted across the airstrip to clear both Cuban construction workers and Grenadian militia from defensive positions, the rest of the Ranger Force set about clearing wire obstacles, barrels, and construction equipment off the airstrip itself. They had enough of the field cleared about 30 minutes after the drop to land the first of the C-130s with their vehicles. About 2 hours after the drop, they had secured the students in the True Blue campus just off the east end of the runway. At this time, the Rangers were informed of the location of another group of students at Grand Anse. At 10:45, the first help arrived, the advance element of the Caribbean Peacekeeping Force, which had been diverted from its original objective at Pearls, where there was no enemy action. The force was most welcome because by this time, the Rangers had captured over 100 Cubans and Grenadian prisoners, and the group of prisoners was beginning to exceed the size of the force left to guard them. The Caribbean Peacekeeping Force gladly accepted this task and freed the Ranger elements to continue their assault. Back at Fort Bragg, the lead aircraft of the Airborne Task Force took off in the early morning hours, and this is what the division assault echelon looked like, a total of 19 aircraft. The lead C-141 touched down at Point Salinas shortly after 1400, and the rifle company aboard literally ran off the ramp and into a firefight. Because of restrictions on the airfield, C-141s had to land singly, disgorge their load, and take off before the next aircraft could come in. But the landing of the initial C-141 began a buildup of U.S. forces that continued almost unabated until hostilities were ended. As the paratroopers arrived, they moved out immediately, joined the Ranger Force, and began to expand the airhead. At about 1500, there occurred one of the more significant enemy actions of the Grenada invasion. A force of about 100 People's Revolutionary Army soldiers, supported by 3 BTR-60 armored cars, counterattacked the east end of the airstrip. The attack literally was shot to pieces. A hail of recoilless rifle fire knocked out the first 2 armored cars, and a Navy A-7 Corsair knocked out the third. By late in the afternoon, a complete airborne infantry battalion had closed on Point Salinas airfield. Early the next morning, the Ranger Force was notified of its attachment to the 82nd Airborne Division. Throughout the night and into the dawn of D+1, the buildup of forces continued. In the early morning, division forces attacked out of the airhead and captured what turned out to be the final major Cuban position, the signal complex at Caliste. The division captured intelligence documents, 81 prisoners of war, and sufficient information to indicate that the Cuban command post for the defense of Grenada was located in the Cuban embassy in St. George's. At about 1000, the 82nd Airborne Division was given the mission to rescue the American students who had been located at the Grand Anse campus, just south of St. George's. Shortly after receipt of that mission, C-141s began to backhaul the American students who had been rescued the day before at the True Blue campus. About 1600 that afternoon, elements of the 2nd Brigade captured a huge warehouse complex at Frequente. The 6 warehouse buildings in the complex were loaded from floor to ceiling with small arms, automatic weapons, ammunition crates, tons of ammunition, some 17,000 uniforms, and other military equipment. In short, enough material to equip about 5 infantry battalions. Military operations on D+1 ended on a dramatic note with the rescue of the students at the Grand Anse campus. The mission had been given to the Ranger Force for planning, and its conduct was a classic. The assault was supported by artillery from the 82nd Airborne Division and 60mm mortars from the Rangers. Air Force AC-130 gunships flew support, as did Navy A-7 close attack aircraft. A 200-man Ranger force from the 2nd Ranger Battalion was lifted out of the pickup zone at Point Salinas Airfield by U.S. Marine Corps helicopters. 2 companies assaulted the beach, swept through the campus, and secured it from the land side. The 3rd Ranger Company of about 60 men secured the 224 students and led them back to Marine Corps evacuation helicopters, who flew in, extracted them, and the Ranger Force back to Point Salinas Airfield. From start to finish, the operation took 26 minutes. The operation had an equally dramatic ending. A Marine Corps helicopter had been shot down in the initial assault. All the Rangers and the crew escaped from the aircraft, and the crew had been extracted along with the final lift. But 11 Rangers were stranded in the objective area. They did what good Rangers do, they went to ground. That night they returned to the helicopter, took out the life raft, inflated it, paddled out to sea, and were picked up later by the fleet. By this time, the number of prisoners of war and detainees had swelled to over 600, and we were beginning to get consistent reports of breakdown in enemy morale and desire to surrender. One of the contributing factors to that breakdown, of course, was the relentless airflow. Literally one C-141 or one C-130 aircraft every hour on the hour, 24 hours a day. As troops built up in the crowded airhead, it was imperative to push them out as rapidly as possible. On the morning of D+2, troops from the 82nd Airborne Division sealed the Lance Al Apines Peninsula, where another large group of U.S. students had been reported. Shortly after noon, the division was ordered to take Calvigny Point before dark. Intelligence had estimated a major enemy command and control headquarters and about 400 troops at Calvigny Point. Again, the Ranger Force was called on. After a heavy prep by A-7 Corsairs, the AC-130 Spectre gunships, and division artillery, the assault went in 82nd Airborne Blackhawks. Fortunately, enemy forces were much smaller than had been predicted, and the Rangers cleared the objective in about an hour. This was the situation on D+3. Airborne troops and Marines finally linked up at the Ross Point Hotel, and after that link-up, elements of the Caribbean Peacekeeping Force began to displace from the 82nd Airborne Division's area into St. George's to occupy key installations there. Around noon, the 82nd Airborne Division found and evacuated an additional 202 U.S. students from the Lance Al Apines Peninsula. In the afternoon, the Rangers were extracted from Calvigny Point and then detached from the 82nd Airborne Division and began their redeployment back to the United States. This move was completed the following day. Among the more significant intelligence finds that day were documents revealing military support agreements between Grenada and Cuba, North Korea, and the Soviet Union. These are the significant events on D+4, Saturday. The Marines captured Mr. Bernard Cord and his wife. Both were evacuated to the USS Guam for safekeeping. By 6 o'clock, the Caribbean Peacekeeping Force had occupied key installations in St. George's and had also displaced an element to Pearls Airfield to secure it. During the day, a battalion task force from the 82nd Airborne Division ran the major road in the division's area and at one point captured a truck park with 19 trucks, 12 of them loaded with small arms ammunition. And that afternoon, U.S. Readiness Command ordered the deployment to Grenada of headquarters elements and support elements from 18th Airborne Corps and 1st Corps Support Command to assist in the logistical buildup and command and control of forces on the island. By the end of D+4, it had become obvious to all that the major enemy resistance had collapsed. On D+5, patrols from the 82nd continued to take prisoners and detainees and to find scattered small arms and ammunition. As had been the case since D-Day, most of the weapons and Cuban and PRA members were turned in by Grenadian citizens, and the combined count of prisoners of war and detainees was approaching 2,000. That afternoon, elements of 82nd Airborne Division captured General Hudson Austin and his two principal henchmen. All were evacuated to the USS Guam, primarily for their safety, and at 2300 that evening, the commander of the Joint Task Force for Urgent Fury directed the CG 82nd Airborne Division to relieve the Marines not later than noon the following day, and to assume the duties of Commander, Combined Forces Grenada, and Commander U.S. Land Forces Grenada. The necessity, of course, was to withdraw the Marine Force as quickly as possible from the operation and to send them on to accomplish what had been their original mission, to relieve the United States Marine Force in Lebanon. By 11:45 the following day, D+6, major elements of the airborne force had relieved the Marines, both in St. George's and at Pearls, and in a series of rapid road and air movements, the battalions and separate companies of the 82nd fanned out across the island and occupied every major population center. Elements of the division air assaulted into the suspected guerrilla warfare camp at Grand Etang and found that it had not been occupied for months. The island-wide occupation was accomplished virtually without incident. By 8 o'clock, the Marine Force had completed its backhaul aboard ship, but before it could steam off to Lebanon, it had one more mission to accomplish. Intelligence reports had indicated a major Cuban and PRA weapons cache and large enemy forces on Carriacou Island, just north of Grenada. Shortly after dawn on D+7, the Marines launched an amphibious assault. By 10:55, the entire island had been secured without a fight, and 17 PRA members, about 750 small arms, and 500 cases of ammunition had been captured. The Marine force was replaced the next day on D+8 by a company from the 82nd. With the completion of that mission, the Marines were free to proceed to Lebanon, and at 1700 hours that day, the Marine Amphibious Ready Group formally chopped back under control of Commander 2nd Fleet. During that day, D+8, Senkland moved command and control of the Caribbean Peacekeeping Force under the Governor General, Sir Paul Schoon, and at 11 o'clock, commander of the Joint Task Force declared hostilities in Grenada to be over. Command of all forces passed to the commander of the airborne force. The following day, Thursday, D+9, the Joint Task Force headquarters for Urgent Fury was formally disestablished. One of the imperatives of Operation Urgent Fury had been to accomplish the missions of the operation as quickly as possible and to withdraw U.S. combat forces at once. That withdrawal began on D+10, Friday, with the redeployment of major elements of the division headquarters, the entire 2nd Brigade, and most of the artillery. The CG departed with the last element of this major part of the combat force, and command of U.S. forces passed to the small forward headquarters of 18th Airborne Corps, which had deployed on D+4. Commander U.S. Forces Grenada retained an airborne brigade based around 3 infantry battalions to accomplish the peacekeeping tasks. For all intents and purposes, Operation Urgent Fury was over. The last U.S. combat forces were withdrawn by 14 December. Urgent Fury was an unqualified success and can best be exemplified by comparing the mission with the results of the operation. The U.S. rescued and evacuated 682 U.S. citizens and 82 foreign nationals. It had neutralized Cuban forces and Grenadian armed forces and captured large amounts of arms, ammunition, and military equipment which had been intended for purposes other than the island's defense. The operation had stabilized a volatile political situation on the island and had left in control an interim government under Sir Paul Schoon with a peacekeeping force made up of Caribbean nations to assist him in the restoration of democratic government on Grenada. However, success was not without a price. The operation cost the United States 19 killed and 116 wounded.